Welcome back to Read by the Author. We are now starting season 4, which is Dissonance, the second novella in the ECHO Trilogy. So this is technically it's installment number 4, which is why this is season 4 in the series, but it's novella 2.5, so it takes place between Time Anomaly, which is book 2, and Ricochet Through Time, which is book 3. So I apologize if you have been waiting in real time for me to finally record this. I have been battling, I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, so I have been battling back-to-back colds, and I am also having another child, and my immune system is not top-notch right now, so these colds just linger, and nobody wants to hear my voice, and nobody wants to hear me reading when my voice sounds like that. So it is, oh my gosh, look at this, an ECHO TRILOGY novella. Oh, well, at least this one's no longer available, this file. That's amazing. Anyway, yeah, so I'm finally feeling better. I'm finally able to record this. I'm hoping that I won't get sick for a while, so I don't have to stop again for at least a few weeks. At least we can hopefully finish this novella, knock on wood and all that good stuff. So, yeah. So, in season 3, we read Time Anomaly. I don't know how to give a quick refresher in that one. Lex, I will say, if you have not listened to seasons 1, 2, and 3, definitely don't start here. This won't make any sense. Go back to season 1. That's the first book in this series, which is the ECHO Trilogy. If you are up to date on all of the books, definitely this is the place that you want to be. And in the last book, Lex traveled back to ancient Egypt and then returned to present day. And at the end of that book, she discovers that she's pregnant with the saviors of the universe. So this is the little in-between story that takes place before we get back to the big overarching plot line that continues with the universe being at risk. So with that, let's get into the story. Dissonance, an ECHO Trilogy novella. 1. Hopes and Fears. I'll be right back, I called through Denny Hall's closing glass door and hurried down the steep stairs on my way to get coffee, careful not to slip. I hugged myself to fend off the damp chill as I made my way along the slick paved pathway. I was antsy and fidgety, so much so that I had completely forgotten to retrieve my jacket before rushing outside, and a brisk walk through the seemingly constant Seattle drizzle would do my frayed nerves good. It had just been a nightmare, or a daymare, I told myself. It had all been in my head, but I couldn't help stopping on the sidewalk by the scene of the imaginary crime and staring down at the spot on the asphalt where Dr. Ramirez's lifeless body had lain what felt like only moments ago. I blinked, squeezing my eyelids shut in an attempt to block out a memory from a dream that had felt far too real. When I opened my eyes again, my heartbeat tripped over itself, and I screamed. No! Dr. Ramirez was there. He shouldn't have been. I had just left him in the lobby of Denny Hall. He was supposed to be inside the old building, safe and sound, and not here. Not in danger. This couldn't be happening. He had just stepped onto the street and was jogging across. At hearing my shout, he paused to look back at me, and not a second later, a speeding station wagon slammed into him. Dr. Ramirez's body rolled up onto the hood, his head hitting the windshield with a sickening crack before he slid back down and was dumped on the asphalt. His arm flopped out to the side, landing in a grimy puddle. Oh my God, Dr. Ramirez! I stumbled across the sidewalk and onto the university's main drag, but I already knew it was too late. I already knew, because I had dreamed about almost this exact horrific thing happening mere minutes ago. I already knew that Dr. Ramirez was dead. But there are no guarantees, Meswet. Dr. Julian Sands veterinarian to the Nejeret stars, stared down at Russ, the tiny, still-as-stone kitten curled up in near eternal slumber beside Marcus's ancient little girl, Tarset. Both were frozen in time, appearing to be statues carved from quartz. Tarset to prevent her body from giving in to the effects of a lethal poison, and Russ because it was the only way to bring him with me into the future. Not in cases like this, Dr. Sands continued, because, well, there aren't any other cases like this. I see. I crossed my arms and cleared my throat. Disturbed as I had been all morning by the third recurrence of the unsettling dream about my former graduate advisor being hit by a car, it was a near-exact replay of the first echo I had ever witnessed, though thankfully it had never truly come to pass. I had managed to pay attention to the highly esteemed and even more highly recommended vet pretty damn well. Dr. Sands reached across the corner of the bed of solidified aught and touched my shoulder. I made a small, unobtrusive hand gesture by my thigh, a preemptive attempt to keep Nick from taking offense at what he would no doubt perceive as an inappropriate and potentially threatening touch. I caught only the slightest movement from him in my periphery, but his heavy exhale told me he wasn't pleased that Dr. Sands' hand was on my shoulder. Sometimes Nick could be so overprotective that he made Marcus's efforts to keep me safe look negligent in comparison. Considering my current delicate condition, that I was carrying unborn twins who were fated to restore balance to the universe, otherwise known as Ma'at to the Nejerets' godlier ancestors, and that I was almost constantly on the verge of having a full-on freak-out breakdown worthy of my very own padded room because of said current condition, I didn't mind so much. I'm not suggesting we don't move forward with little Russ's transition, Dr. Sands said. I'm just saying we should proceed with extreme caution. Take it slow. Pathogens are tricky, and they evolve quickly. It would be impossible to predict what will and won't harm him. Any immunity he's developed so far will be irrelevant. He'll have to start over from scratch. I swallowed, and it sounded obscenely loud in the barren, sterile room. Again, I said, I see. We were underground in the basement of the main house in the Haru compound, in a small room on the periphery of Neffy's intricate home lab setup, where she and Aset were leading up a team hard at work trying to find a solution to the Tarset problem, how to revive a little girl who had been poisoned thousands of years ago and frozen in time ever since. Tarset and Russ had been down in this room since we had returned from the Nejeret oasis in the Sahara a week earlier. It was a cold space, hardly ideal for a child, and we were all eager to restore Marcus's little girl, and me, my 10-week, going on 5,000-year-old kitten, to life as soon as possible, or rather, as soon as was safe. Dr. Sands was renowned throughout the Nejeret community for being the most experienced and knowledgeable practitioner of animal medicine alive today. He had over a millennium of caring for Nejeret pets under his belt, and he had traveled halfway across the world to Bainbridge Island to help me with my tiny, out-of-time kitten situation. If anyone would be able to help Russ survive the transition into the modern world, it was this man. Dr. Sands withdrew his hand from my shoulder and ran his fingers through his dirty blonde hair. Give me a couple days to draw up a plan and put together a full series of vaccinations, Meswet. He flashed me a brilliant smile, belying the mild uncertainty in his eyes. I'm confident we'll have little Russ running around and bothering Thora in no time. At the thought of Russ catting around with my older tabby, Thora, I actually managed to return the veterinarian's smile. I nodded and held my arm out toward the open doorway, where Nick and Dominic stood sentry and Carlisle, Marcus's man, waited with his ever-present smartphone in hand. Please, make yourself at home in the lab. Neffy won't mind. Dominic snorted. Much, I added. And just let Carlisle know what you need, and he'll help make the arrangements. Wonderful, Dr. Sands said. He started toward Carlisle and the guarded doorway to the lab, but he paused midway and looked at me over his shoulder. It will be the same for the girl, you know. The adjustment to modern pathogens. With a slow blink, I redirected my focus to Tarset's opalescent, cherubic face and felt a single tear sneak over the brim of my eyelid and glide down my cheek. Tarset had been poisoned over 5,000 years ago, and not only did we not know what Apep on Kesempepi had used to poison the oasis's water supply, we didn't even know if an antidote could be created or if the damage the poison had caused to Tarset's young body could be reversed. Her suspended state was the only thing keeping her from death. Once we unfroze her, the ancient little girl would be lucky if she survived long enough to worry about modern pathogens, which was precisely why Nephi had hunted down the best and brightest scientifically minded Nejerets to assist her and Aset in finding a way to save Marcus's little girl. That's the least of her problems, I said quietly. Aren't you finished with your consult yet? Nephi said, brusque as ever. I turned in time to see her brushing past Carlyle and Dr. Sands on her way into the room, what appeared to be a small insulated lunchbox slung over her shoulder. My team can't do anything more until we have our samples. She strode toward me, stopped beside the otbed, and set the insulated container down next to Russ, then met my eyes and winked. Which means I need your help right now, Nick, so I can get my samples. I suppressed a grin. For whatever reason, Nephi loved being a pain in the ass. It had taken me a while to pick up on it, but once it became obvious to Nephi that I was onto her, she started to find little ways to let me in on the joke. So far as I could tell, she simply liked to see how far she could push people. Probably because she was bored. Living for several millennia tended to do that to a person. Nick let out a heavy sigh. I just don't know if I'm up to it today. Due to his unusual circumstances of birth, being born of 2 Nejerets, Nick had his own minor shoot that, much like the borrowed shoot I had been carrying for the past couple months, gave him certain powers beyond the normal Nejeret. In Nick's case, he could manipulate the very fabric of the Ot, giving it physical form, or, as Nephi needed him to do, reverting Ot particles to their original molecular structure, Nejeret flesh and bone. I glanced at Nick, taking in his bored expression, his usual hint of a smirk, but I didn't miss the sparkle of amusement in his 2 pale blue eyes. My attention returned to Nephi just in time to catch the tail end of what appeared to be a rather pleased grin. Carlyle escorted a somewhat confused Dr. Sands out of the room, leaving Nick, Dominic, Nephi, and myself behind. If you do not do what she wants, she'll go out of her way to make your life difficult until you give in, Dominic said, his French accent making the words sound like even more of a warning. Trust me, I know. Nephi gave me a look that said, yeah, he's probably right, as well as words ever could. With a sigh, Nick pushed away from the wall and made his way to the bedside, feet dragging just a bit. My chute is at your disposal, princess. Nephi closed her eyes for a moment, collecting herself. True, she liked acting the haughty, irritable vixen for fun, but she genuinely had a Quicksilver disposition, and Nick's new favorite nickname for her, Princess, was one of her triggers. It didn't matter that she had grown up a princess in Middle Kingdom Egypt, the daughter of Queen Hatshepsut, or that her father had been the Nejeret equivalent to a king, but had abdicated the figurative throne during Nephi's adolescence. She hated being called princess. If you call me that one more time, Nephi said through clenched teeth, I will tear that ridiculous ring out of your eyebrow. Nick leaned in close to Nephi and whispered, Promise? I could practically see the shiver work its way over her body, could all but sense her sudden discomfort as she sidled closer to me. Nick had that effect on people. Whether it was the array of tattoos covering his body from the neck down in various shades of fading gray, his standoffish attitude, or the fact that Ra, the godly being who had once been the father of our kind, resided within his body, Most people found him disturbing, Nejeret and human alike. Me? I just liked to think of him as unique. Nick tossed me a shit-eating grin. He knew the effect he had on Neffy and pretty much everyone else. He liked it. So, I looked from Nick to Neffy and back. Should we get started? I know Marcus wanted to catch the 10 o'clock ferry, and it's got to be nearly 9. ECHO TRILOGY, Dominic offered. I glanced at him, still standing sentry by the doorway, and offered him a small smile and a nod. Yes, very well. Neffy pointed to Tarset's arm, shrouded in a thin but impervious and unmovable blanket. Nick, I need you to restore her elbow area, maybe an inch above and an inch below, then her mouth, just for a moment. That will give me blood, tissue, and saliva samples, she said, ticking each off on her fingers. Which will have to be good enough. We can't risk restoring her vital organs, not even for a second. So be careful. Surprised by the sudden heat in her voice, I glanced at Neffy's face. Her caramel eyes burned with an intensity I had only seen a time or two before. And then it struck me. This wasn't just some little girl we were trying to revive. This was her sister. Though Neffy had never actually met Tarset, having been born over 1,000 years later, they were sisters. I hadn't met any of Marcus's other children in modern times. Honestly, I wasn't sure if there were any others still living. His past families were a touchy subject for Marcus, and though I had unearthed a fair bit of his humanity under the stony wall built up by millennia of life and death and love and loss, I still had a colossal amount of chiseling to do. In some ways, Marcus was almost as ensconced in time as little Tarset. When Nick didn't respond to Neffy's cautioning to take care, Neffy made to reach for his arm, but stopped herself short. Instead, she made a fist. If you're at all unsure...
Nick is not entirely confident in his ability to wield his shoot so specifically.
The words had been uttered using Nick's vocal cords, tongue and lips, but their cadence and accent hinted at another speaker entirely. One quick glance at Nick's face, at the open, relaxed expression and the opalescent irises now staring back at me, confirmed it. Nick was no longer in control. Ra was.
I will do this for you instead, Neferure.
His lips curved upwards in a smile that looked nothing like Nick's.
Personally, I'd rather not feel the pain of this ring tearing through our flesh.
Neffy stammered. Of course not, great father. She cleared her throat. I wouldn't have actually. It
is fine, child,
Ra Nick said, touching Neffy's arm.
I understand more than you think. Now, shall we begin?
2. Wanting and waiting. I am so excited, Kat said, bouncing on the balls of her feet as she stood at the bottom of the grand stairway in the main house, what I had come to call simply the house. It was easily a mansion, and as classically designed as it was on the outside, it was equally modern and subdued on the inside. And the thing was enormous, boasting at least a dozen bedrooms and enough secondary rooms to complete a small neighborhood. Watching my youngest, that I knew of, sister from one of several understated gray couches in the sitting room beside the entryway, I smiled to myself. In her cut-off jean shorts and flowy t-shirt, and with her hair coiled up into a messy top knot, and the worn leather satchel containing her sketching supplies that seemed to be on her at all times lately, hanging easily across her body, she looked the stereotypical 18-year-old. She looked carefree and confident, not a worry in the world. My smile wilted. That couldn't be further from the truth. I think we're all ready to get out and stretch our legs somewhere that isn't here, I said, interrupting my souring mood by filling the silence, and isn't packed full of Nejerets. I glanced at Neffy, who was seated on the opposite end of the couch from me, flipping through a scientific journal like she was skimming for the season's latest and greatest in a fashion magazine. I mean, no offense, of course, it's just... We had been cooped up in the compound for the past week, and I was fairly certain we were all starting to feel like caged animals. Trust me, Lex, I get it. Neffy offered me a minute smile without actually looking at me. I'm as eager as young Cat for our little trip into the city. As was I, though after the dream I had woken from again this morning, I wagered I had very different reasons than the others. More than anything, I needed to reassure myself that the recurring nightmare had been only that, a mere figment of an overwrought mind's overactive imagination. I returned my attention to Cat, taking note of her suddenly stiff posture and how her hands balled into fists at her sides. She took a deep breath, then another, and I waited for the impending explosion. She could stand Neffy calling her young Cat, less than Neffy could stand Nick's nickname of Princess. Cat took one more, deeper breath, and I was in the middle of mentally commending her for her unusual show of self-restraint when she opened her mouth and yelled, "Marcus!" up the stairs, very, very loudly. My ears rang from the unexpected influx of way too much sound. Sometimes heightened Nejerets senses could be a real pain. Okay! I jumped up and rushed to the stairway. Let's not do that again. Ever, Cat turned to me as I approached, her expression sheepish. Sorry. I touched her shoulder as I passed her and headed up the stairs. I'm going to check on Marcus. I'm sure he's getting ready right now. He'd better be if we wanted to make the ferry. Ascending the final few stairs, I glanced back at Cat. Go track down Dom and Nick, will you? Let them know we're about to head out. Yeah, okay. And just like that, she was back to bouncing as she skipped along the hallway that led to the other rooms deeper in the house. Thank you for not leaving me alone with her, I heard Neffy say under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear. I rolled my eyes. Family. I stared down at the sparkling ripples of water from the upper deck of the ferry, seeing another time, another place in the Puget Sound's inky depths. In my mind, I was surrounded by jagged limestone outcroppings and sand and the driest heat I had ever felt. Before me, Marcus, or rather Haru, knelt on the rock-strewn sand, a tall wall of limestone on one side of us, a pile of boulders on the other. My memory of him staring up at me while he pledged his life to mine was so fresh in my mind it might as well have happened mere hours ago, not thousands of years ago. I shook my head and frowned, embracing the refreshing sea air. It was a perfect August day in the Sound, a solid 80 degrees, ideal tank top and sandals weather, ideal ferry weather. My father would have enjoyed the ferry ride greatly today, Neffy said from beside me. She had been my silent companion at the deck railing for some 15 minutes, and I had utilized that time to thoroughly lose myself in thought. Thinking of Marcus, or more specifically, of his absence, I suppressed another frown. Whatever the Council of Seven was discussing must have been very important for him to miss this, Neffy added, and I glanced at her, just long enough to see the concern in her eyes. I had fought hard to keep our little day trip alive once it became clear that Marcus wouldn't be able to leave his virtual meeting with the Council for hours yet, and Neffy had been my main ally, but I hadn't expected Marcus to actually agree. As silly as it sounds, considering I'd gotten my way, I felt a little let down. It was important, I said. Ish. I caught a glimpse of Nick out of the corner of my eye. He was leaning against the railing several dozen feet up deck from us, his back to the water as he kept a close eye on everyone and everything within his range of sight. Marcus and the council had been discussing him, specifically whether or not they should force him to be the 9th member of the Council of Seven, what with me being the honorary 8th member, and the council having a hard time making any decisions now that they boasted an even number of members. Remotely, I wondered if they had been changing the name. Remotely, I wondered if they would be changing the name now that the of 7 no longer applied. Marcus had called for a short break when I had come upstairs to check on him, but not before I had heard the heated voices coming from the conference room.
I can't leave right now, little Ivanov,
Marcus told me, regret filling his burnished golden eyes.
We'll have to postpone until tomorrow.
I pressed my lips together and studied his resigned features. Are you sure you have to be here for this? I asked, flicking my eyes toward the shut door behind him and the conference room with its 6 monitors, one for each of the members of the Council of 7. I had ducked out of the meeting when Dr. Sands had arrived a couple hours earlier. It had been little more than a silent standoff when I'd been present. The discussion was pointless, which I had already expressed, thus the silent standoff. But none of them knew Nick, or Ra, as well as I did, not even Marcus. I had tried to tell them that nobody could make Nick do something he didn't want to do, especially not when Ra himself had no interest in taking part in the Nejeret governing body. But several of the council members had refused to believe me. Surely Marcus's time was better spent elsewhere, like in Seattle with me. Marcus reached out and curved his hand around the side of my neck, brushing his thumb slowly over my lips until they parted. He made a low, guttural sound, something between a groan and a sigh.
Much as I hate to see such disappointment in your eyes, little Ivanov, yes, I need to be here for this.
Grasping his wrist, I turned my face to the side and kissed his palm. Meeting his eyes, I pulled back a hair's breadth and said, "But I don't." I watched Marcus's striking features tense.
Lex.
I stood a little taller. There's no reason I shouldn't go without you. Before he could protest, I barreled on without thought. We've had zero indication that anyone has any interest in hurting me right now, and Saga and Heimdall have already scoured the stable portions of the yacht and saw nothing to be worried about in Seattle today. Besides, Dr. Ramirez rearranged his entire schedule today to fit me in. Apparently he had an artifact for me to look at, though I had no idea what it was or where he had come by it, just that it had made him think of me. His email a few days back had sparked unexpected happiness, as though he was my last true connection to the purely human world, and now, with the dreams about him dying, I was especially determined to visit him today. Plus, Neffy said from behind me, both Nick and Dom will be there, and even if you've all but admitted that Nick is... And even you have all but admitted that Nick is better at protecting Lex than you are. I sucked in my breath and leaned back a little as soon as the words were out of Neffy's mouth. That had been the absolutely wrong thing for her, for anyone, to say to Marcus. My bondmate withdrew his hand and clenched it into a fist, and my whole body tensed in anticipation of what I was betting would be a rather grand argument. Marcus closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and slowly released it, then relaxed his hand and looked at me.
Very well, little Ivanov. If you still wish to go into the city today, you have my...
My eyes narrowed in anticipation of the next word that would come out of his mouth, and he paused. So help me if he even started to utter the word permission. Marcus's perfect, chiseled cheek twitched.
You have my blessing.
I flashed him a humorless smile. Clearly, we were still working some of the kinks out of our relationship. Yes, well, my father can spend all day in his precious meeting for all I care. Neffy nudged my shoulder. At least we get to get out and have some fun, yeah? I met her gaze and smiled, knowing full well it didn't touch my eyes. I felt off, and not only because Marcus hadn't been able to join us. No, it was something else, something different. It was as though I was waiting for something to happen. I just didn't know what I was waiting for. It's probably just the dream, I told myself. Neffy touched her fingertips to my forearm. I'm going to run in and grab a coffee. Do you want anything? I shook my head. Thanks, though, I said, absently, and she walked away. In my periphery, I spotted Kat approaching from the stern, her sketchbook hugged to her chest. Her expression darkened suddenly, and she made an about-face and headed instead toward the bench where Dominic was sitting. Turning to confirm my suspicion of what she had seen, I leaned my hip against the railing, not the least bit surprised to find that Nick had moved closer. His back was still to the water, but he now stood right beside me. I crossed my arms over my chest and narrowed my eyes. You know, you have the most interesting effect on people. He glanced at me sidelong, his pale eyes glittering. I hadn't noticed. I rolled my eyes. I'm sure. I'm not the only one who has an interesting effect on people, you know. Nick turned his face to me, his usual smirk absent for once. What are you... My eyes widened. You mean me? I said, touching the tip of my index finger to my chest. Nick tucked his hands into his jeans pockets. They were a dark gray instead of his usual black, his concession to the warm weather, and shrugged one shoulder. His gaze grew distant, and he nodded slowly. You know, when I first met you in that temple back in Mendna Fair, I thought it was the chute you carried. But then when I sat with you on the bus, more or less chute-free, well, that blew that theory all to hell. I was actually a little nervous to talk to you. He laughed to himself. I mean, even with just a sliver of Ra's chute, you were still the most intimidating person I had ever met. Other than the Great Father, of course. Of course, I said dryly, mostly because I was too caught off guard to say anything else. I was intimidating? Like Nick-level intimidating? I turned back toward the water and leaned my forearms on the railing. And still, underneath the confusion at Nick's revelation, I felt it. That oh-so-strange sense of waiting. Okay, I'm going to stop right here on Chapter 3. I can already feel it in my voice. My voice is not 100% yet, apparently. So I'm going to stop here. I think this chapter is a little bit long, and I don't think I'll make it through it without getting all crackly. So, thank you for listening. I will be back next week, hopefully, assuming we don't get another cold in our household, to continue Dissonance. Until then, happy reading.